it's fitting, I think, that we consider these matters here today at Rokeby. Why? Because all the land that comprises the town of Red Hook today was granted by King James II in 1688 to Colonel Peter Schuyler of Albany. And within just a few years, at least the southern portion of Schuyler's patent, as it was called, was bought by Colonel Henry Beekman of Rhinebeck. And he, entrepreneur that he was, very quickly lured down from Germantown quite a number of farmers, leaseholding farmers who had emigrated, of course, to Germantown from the Rhineland, from the German Palatinate. And they were so lucky to be lured down to this paradise, and we are so lucky that they came here because they created our economy and continue to support our economy as the lifeblood of Rhinebeck and Red Hook. Now, what happened to the underlying title to the land, at least this Beekman part of Red Hook, as it is today? It descended to Alida Livingston and her husband, General John Armstrong, in the late 18th century, Alida being a descendant of Schuyler and Beekman and Livingston's. And John Armstrong served from 1805 to 1810 as the American minister in Paris. And when he came back in 1810 and in 1811, he bought out the leaseholds of 5 of those Palatine farms that had belonged to his wife, the 5 that were nearest the Hudson River, not surprisingly, and consolidated them into one large farm, which he called La Bergerie, the sheepfold, because Napoleon had given him a herd of his own merino sheep to start the farm that Armstrong had told him he wanted to retire to, like Cincinnatus at the plow, after public service, come back to the farm and resume life in the country. There are 2 parts to this talk. The first is the origin of the town of Red Hook. And next slide, please. There are 3 images here. General Armstrong is in the middle, and then to your right is Morgan Lewis, who was a state senator at the time from this neighborhood, and to the left, another state senator, Edward P. Livingston. As it happens, Morgan Lewis, former governor of New York, was General Armstrong's brother-in-law, and Edward P. Livingston of Claremont was General Armstrong's nephew-in-law. And very likely he and others who wanted to create this, have the town created, applied to them. We know that Armstrong did, applied to Senator Lewis to initiate the legislation, because that is in the record in Albany. Not everything survives, sadly, in the records in Albany because of the catastrophic fire at the State Library in 1911 destroyed a great deal that would have been valuable for us to know. In any event, within weeks of Armstrong taking that initiative, in the beginning of 1812, as I said outside, war was declared, and he was appointed by President Madison commander of the defenses of New York City, and then very soon after that, Secretary of War for most of the duration of the War of 1812, and he was not able to return to Red Hook until late in 1814, when he completed the construction of this house. The headline of the legislation, an act for dividing the town of Rhinebeck in the county of Dutchess. It was passed on the 2nd of June, 1812, and as I said, that was just 16 days before declaration of war. There was no connection between the two. It's just a coincidence of history. At least we think so. Next. And here's some of the verbiage of the law describing its location. Basically, it is saying we're following the boundaries of the old Schuyler's patent from 1688. It doesn't say that here, but it's in effect that. There was no stated formula in law in those days decreeing when and how, when a town could be created. It just called for a local initiative, applying to the legislature, and then, although it doesn't say this, no evidence of strong opposition on the part of some in the community. As far as we know, no one in Rhinebeck, the new town of Rhinebeck, smaller town of Rhinebeck, objected to this. At least there's no record that they did. We know how it was done. We just do not necessarily know why it was done. But we can hypothesize ease of administration. In that time of pedestrian travel and horseback travel, the closer that local government could be to the voter and to the constituent, the better it was for democracy, the more efficient it was for local government. And then we know from census information in 1820, just a few years after the legislation passed, and gazetteer information, which was another way to collect data, also dating from about 1820. Essentially, the two new towns emerging out of the old town of Rhinebeck were equal in population, essentially equal in acreage, and essentially equal in taxable assessment. So there would have been no source for grievance on those points. However, it's also clear that Red Hook was favored in agricultural productivity. We have, and have today, better soils than Rhinebeck does. And this was reflected in the much larger herd of sheep in the town of Red Hook than in Rhinebeck. And industry, we were somewhat ahead of the game in industry. We had more mills of various kinds, sawmills, grist mills, fulling mills, which are mills for the processing of wool. We also had, what Rhinebeck did not have, a distillery. I'd like to think that we were sending the product of the distillery to Rhinebeck when there was a call for it. Rhinebeck, on the other hand, was ahead of us by a far piece in personal wealth. That is, money in the bank, the value of your furnishings in your house, the value of the inventory in your shops, the value of your carriages and horses and so forth. Also, Rhinebeck was ahead of us in the number of students being taught and the number of teachers doing the teaching. This is a 19th century rendering of the parts of the old town of Rhinebeck that's been doctored a bit just to show you where the new Rhinebeck is, which is in green, plus the white bit of Kippsbergen. I don't know why that didn't get painted green. Kippsbergen down there around Rhinecliff. And then everything else that's sectored off is the new town of Red Hook, with an exception that I'll tell you at the end of the talk. And that's essentially Schuyler's patent. We have to assume, I think, in the absence of any proof otherwise, that the action of creating the town of Red Hook was primarily due to the wish of a few men of local influence to be bigger fish in a smaller pond. Now, this is part of the legislation, and it tells what the next step is. The first town meeting of the town of Red Hook shall be held in the house of Henry Walter, Reed Inn of Henry Walter, but not for another 10 months. The town didn't really get underway in business as a municipal corporation until April 6th of 1813. Here is the governor who signed the bill on June 2nd of 1812. Daniel Tompkins was a great war governor of the state, very involved in much of the War of 1812 was waged in either Canada or in New York State, up along the St. Lawrence River and out of the Niagara frontier. And so the governor, as head of the state militia, had an important role to play. If you, however, listen to television documentary of the War of 1812, which will be broadcast over the next few years, you'll think the whole thing had to do with the Star-Spangled Banner down in Baltimore, or Andrew Jackson in New Orleans, or the British, sadly, burning the Capitol and the White House. In fact, we New Yorkers know that what really counted was going on in upstate New York. After he served his term as governor, he served 2 terms as Monroe's vice president, so he was no insignificant player. Next. Okay, where was Henry Walter's home, or Henry Walter's Inn? It was where the regrettable Mobil station is, or the center of Red Hook today. But for many, many years, it was the site of the Red Hook Hotel. Some of us are old enough to remember that. Here's a photograph of that hotel taken 100 years ago or more. Somewhere buried inside that building is probably the house of Henry Walter, the Inn of Henry Walter, which in 1813 was the site of our first town board meeting. Here are the actual minutes of that board meeting, preserved in the Red Hook Town Halls. And it's worth just taking a moment to tell you a bit about what seemed important to the town board at that time. April 6, 1813, General David Van Ness became our supervisor. He was the man who, he was a general in the militia before and during the Revolution, but he was 71 years old when he became supervisor. Today, that would be the equivalent of 120. I mean, this is incredibly old to be assuming the responsibility of running the town. But he wanted it, and they gave it to him. The other posts that were filled included pathmasters. Today, we'd call them highway superintendents. The pathmasters were designated, lived along assigned stretches of road, and their job was to get their neighbors to join them in maintaining that stretch of road. This was not something that was coming out of the common funds of the town. Pound masters. Bulls, rams, and male swine were forever getting loose and creating havoc. This is a serious problem in the agricultural community. And the pound masters, I think, could lay claim to the value of the animal if they could catch them. They would have to be, bought back, I guess, by the farmer who would let them run free. 5 assessors. Today we have only 1 assessor. What were they afraid of? Strength in numbers in case there was a tax revolt, I guess. 6 fence viewers. There's a heavy burden. To be a fence viewer. I wonder how much they were paid out of the tax fund for that. But in fact, this had to do with that poundmaster's work. It was important that these farms had fences that kept the animals in and the wild animals out, and also were faithful to where the actual boundaries of the leased farm or the freehold farm was, so the people weren't beginning to take adverse possession of their neighbor's land. So that was an important responsibility. And then overseers of the poor. The statute itself required that two new towns agree on an equitable division of funds that had already been set aside from the taxes to support the poor. Remember that Christ said, the poor are always with us. And I think that the people of Red Hook wanted to be sure that the poor that were with them weren't, some of them, the poor that belonged to Rhinebeck, and vice versa. In any event, that had to be sorted out and was promptly. And finally, the town of Red Hook acceded to a state bounty program for the elimination of wolves, bears, panthers, and the noxious weed Canada thistle. This seems bizarre, but in fact I think wild animals were coming across the river, especially on the ice in the winter, and was a concern. But what in the world, the noxious weed, Canada thistle, there's a part of me that wants to believe this was a hidden reference to the Canadians who were causing such a military threat on the northern frontier, but I don't know. Some botanist can tell us what the Canada thistle was, if there was such a thing. Next, please. All right, now on to the maps. This is part 2. An act of the legislature in 1797 required that the towns provide to the Surveyor General of the state, a man named Simeon DeWitt, a map of the town that showed the boundaries of the town. The reason for this was that Simeon DeWitt, by that legislation, was directed to create a detailed and accurate map of the state of New York as it was then. And in fact he did, depending on the input from all of the communities, and that map became the template, really, of state maps throughout the country. And the state of New York sent copies of DeWitt's map, which was engraved and reproduced, to all the other states that then existed, saying, aren't we great? You go and be great too, get your properties mapped. And so it was the first state map of its kind created in the US. And we made a significant contribution to that. Alexander Thompson was hired by the town of Rhinebeck, and perhaps assisted by some private contributions, to create a wonderfully detailed map of the larger town, not just Rhinebeck of today, but the larger town, which included both Red Hook and Rhinebeck, in 1798. And in fact, 4 versions of that map were created. The wonderful thing about Thompson's map, however, which I think is probably very different from all the other town maps created at direction of the state legislature, was that ours is just so gloriously filled with information that the state wasn't particularly asking for. And we will tell you about that in a moment. Next slide. Here's Alexander Thompson, a picture of him, the surveyor, and on one of the maps, the manuscript maps that was created, the one that now belongs to Historic Hudson Valley, the organization that owned Montgomery Place, you can see that the surveyor has identified his own house, more or less in the vicinity of the Rhinebeck Town Hall now on East Market Street. There's A. Thompson there, circled in red. What he put on his maps, as I say, distinct from other town maps, was, and this may be where private property owners and businesses contributed to enrich the product: mills, churches, inns, roads, streams, river landings, homes of freeholders, and so forth. 152 features are named on these maps. Some appear on all of the maps, and some of those appear just on several of the maps, because they are distinct differences from map to map, but they're all based on the same survey and essential information. The matrix that lists all of those features, prepared by Nancy Kelly wonderfully, I've put on the dining room table. There are also reproductions of all 4 of these great maps, and the map of Red Hook that was made later on the table for you to examine. None of them, I have to hasten to say, are the original map there, but they're good reproductions of them. And if you look at them, you'll see General Armstrong's house identified in a grand way. It's not this house. It's the house that he built, that he called Mill Hill, on the exact location of what today is the Blythewood Mansion on the campus of Bard College. That was the house that he occupied in the late 1790s. He didn't build this house, as I said, until 1811. Next slide. So here are the 4 that we now have access to. All based on this basic information, but each one slightly different. The first one was the one that the state demanded of Rhinebeck. It's in the New York State Archives in Albany. It's been there ever since 1798. It's been scanned at our request and is available to us. The second one is perhaps the best of them, owned by Historic Hudson Valley, the organization. This was done almost certainly for Janet Livingston Montgomery, who was at the time the owner of Grassmere, or the mansion that is now called Grassmere, but it burned, and the building that's there now was built many years later. And then a few years after the map was made, and she left Grassmere and built what is today Montgomery Place, so she came up to Red Hook. But at the time the map was made, she was the owner of much of what is now the village of Rhinebeck, and significant lands adjacent to the village in the town of Rhinebeck. And then the third map is one with a very exciting story. It was owned for many years by the Rhinebeck Gazette, our local newspaper. It was in their offices in Rhinebeck. The newspaper went through numerous ownerships. One of the owners 25 years ago was Hamilton Meserve, who lived in Armenia. He liked the map. He took it to his house. He sold the newspaper. He sold the house. he sold the map at an auction. We didn't know about it. I'm not sure that we could have acquired it because it went for $15,000. But we thought when we heard this after the fact, we couldn't track it, we didn't know who bought it, that we'd lost it forever, and the information that it contained would be so important to us. And then this miraculous thing happened. We discovered that it was bought by you and me. It was bought by the federal government for the Library of Congress. And it is there, it's being conserved, it's been scanned, and a version of it, or a reproduction of it, is available to us. And so we really got lucky, and so we can draw information from all 4 versions of this enormously important manuscript. Next. I should say that helping Thompson was another surveyor named Benjamin Van Steenberg. You don't know too much about him. So here's the first of the 4 maps. This is the one that originally went to Albany and is still there. Call it the Archives map. And it has information, it has roads, it has streams, it has significant buildings identified, churches and inns. A lot of the little images are simply of leasehold farmhouses, little sort of one-chimney house figures scattered all over without names attached. And then the bigger houses of freehold owners are identified by name. Next. This is what we think is the best. This is the one owned by Historic Hudson Valley. I'm delighted to say that it's been brought up from storage in Tarrytown to Montgomery Place during this bicentennial season, this bicentennial summer. The original of this map can be examined at Montgomery Place. If you go there, it's open on weekends. Pretty exciting to see it. And it has the most detailed information of any of them. Now we look at some details. This is the Historic Hudson Valley or Montgomery Place version. That's the Library of Congress version. It's more of a white background. And this shows details of the village of Red Hook, or the neighborhood of Red Hook. The mills on Mill Road, crossing the Sawkill, just north of the village. The Elmendorph Inn is shown in red. And we didn't paint it red. They thought it was important enough to make red back in 1798. And then, oh, that's the dog. She's tired of hearing this talk. And then Maizeland, General Van Ness's great red brick house in Red Hook is shown on a sort of a hilltop. And of course, it isn't on a hilltop, but it's just depicted that way to indicate its importance in the community. And it's not quite that far from the crossroads in Red Hook, but they take certain liberties when they make maps. Next. Now here are the mills. Of course, these photographs are made many years after the map, probably 100 years ago or more. But Chancellor Livingston's mill was there at the time of the map being made, and they were still in operation as industrial facilities at the turn of the last century. They're now gone. Next. Here's Maizeland. This was the home of General Van Ness. In the 19th century, the polygonal wing to the left was added, the 3rd floor was added, but it's a great federal house surviving behind this red brick wall in the village of Red Hook. Next. And the Elmendorph Inn, a wonderful drawing done by one of the people who helped to save the inn and to restore it wonderfully and to bring it into such an appropriate community use for the late Bob Bielenberg. He was an artist as well as everything else involved in bringing that building back from the edge of doom, and is probably the oldest structure in what is now the village of Red Hook, certainly the oldest one that's known to all, dating from the 1750s. So that's 50 years. It was 50 years old when the maps were made. Next. This is the version that's been for many, many years in the Starr Library. I don't know, I'm not sure that they know how it came into their possession. It's in need of conservation, and when and if that occurs, and I hope it will be scanned and more available to us, and the information on it. But it's another very valuable artifact of our past. Next. This is a version of the Starr Library Map that was made 30 years ago or so. I'm not sure if it's a photographic version, I don't think so, but it's helpful. Next. Here are some of the buildings that show up in Rhinebeck on these maps. The Kip-Beekman-Heermance House, of course, is now just an archaeological site owned by the Rhinebeck Historical Society, gift of the late Arthur Suckley. And the principal part of the original building was given to the federal government by the Suckleys, and the Rhinebeck Post Office was created, of course, on a different location with the very stone and using the photographs and architectural renderings that they had of the old building after it burned. Well, the photographs and the architectural drawings were made before it burned in 1909, and then in the 1930s it was given to the government. Next. And here's a photograph of it that shows obviously the post office part is off to the right, but a very early additions to it, gambrel roof, the dormers, is coming off to the left. And some of the remains of that portion of it are still standing back in the woods there on the way to the Rhinecliff. Kip is not spelled correctly there, it should have one P. But this was a very important place for a very long time. Not only does it date from the very end of the 17th century, that is the 1690s, but during the Revolution, it was the home of Henry Beekman's widow, his second wife, and Henry Beekman's son-in-law, or rather stepson, Stephanus Van Cortlandt, who was the Lord of Van Cortlandt Manor in Westchester County, and because of the war, he'd been driven off his lands down there, and he was living with his mother as a tenant, basically. Both of them were tenants of Colonel Henry Beekman Livingston, who had inherited it from his grandfather, Beekman. But at that time, Van Cortlandt was the elected Lieutenant Governor of New York. So this was, could be seen as one of the official residences or government centers for New York during the Revolution. Next slide. And this is just across the street. This, of course, survives. Where 308 makes a sharp turn to go up into the village of Rhinebeck. This is the Abraham Kip House of the early 18th century. Next. And up in Red Hook, the old Red Church isn't quite as old as some people think. It dates from the 1820s as a building, but as a site of worship, it dates from the 1750s and is one of the earliest sites of worship in northern Dutchess County. It's also of interest to us in that when the successor church, St. John's Reformed Church in Upper Red Hook, became the principal site of the congregation in the 19th century. It wasn't clear what was going to happen to this, and it didn't get much use, and it started to fall apart, and it had its friends, and it's been held together by tape and baling wire for a long, long time, and you can see there's still scaffolding there as it continued work on it. But it is one of the, it's of interest to me because it's probably one of the longest continuing efforts at historic preservation in the county. That is, from the late 19th century, people have worried about what to do with the Red Church. And it does have, every 4th of July they have a service there, but it's an important icon from our past. Next. The Heermance farmstead on West Curly Corners Road in Red Hook is a wonderful survivor. It's very intact to its period in the mid-18th century, the 1750s. Stone farmhouse, rather grand for its time, and in its wonderful agricultural landscape. And it's in very good hands now. It's been bought by somebody who is committed to preserving it and preserving the land around it. Next, it was on our house tour, our Bicentennial house tour. And a much simpler farmhouse, and one of the farmhouses of those those Palatine tenant farmers that I spoke of is right here at Rokeby. This is across River Road from where we are this afternoon. This picture was taken in the 1930s. It doesn't look like that today because we've had to remodel it in order to make it function as a rented residence, but it probably dates from the middle of the 18th century too, and shows you that those Palatine Germans were living pretty simply, you know, off the soil here, and this is a rare survivor from that time. There are others. There's that wonderful one that's being restored in the town of Rhinebeck on the post road just south of the stone church. Next. Incidentally, that's a covered staircase that goes down into the basement that at some point was added to the house, I guess. Okay, here's the stone church, the Quitman Parsonage, and Maizeland Inn is on the little jog of a road. It weighs corners there between 9 and 9G. The map isn't exactly right. Quitman House is on the left side of the stone church, the north side, rather than the south side. Next. We're identifying here some of the buildings that survive, or sites that survive, that can be identified on the maps. The Traphagen's Tavern, of course, the Beekman Arms, that shows in this detail on the Library of Congress map, the center of today's village of Rhinebeck. And the Grassmere is off to one side there, again, not the original Grassmere, but somewhat later. And then the Martin-Heermance House is just across from the Starr Library, and is under restoration now. The Italianate Tower was added later, but the basic house was a federal house that was standing at the time the map was made in 1798, having been built just a few years before. Next. Up in Annandale, from the historic Hudson Valley map, you see Armstrong's mill at a turn of the Sawkill, and then the site in the photograph shows that the remains of that mill, which went through a number of uses and iterations to include a chocolate factory, was wonderfully revived and remodeled and reused by Frank and Ruth O.J. in the 1960s as the site of their house, which was also on our house tour several weeks ago. And it takes advantage of this very dramatic situation, one of the major falls of the Sawkill. And Ruth would tell you what it was like to be in that house during Irene, when it appeared that all the water that existed in the world was coming right, literally through the basement, because that's what a mill did. It took water through the basement, and there would be a wheel or a turbine there, and they had closed that off, but Irene opened it up again. But it was very well built, and it survived without too much problem. Next. And a very grand house, which was called by the community, if not by the family, Hoffman's Castle, the 2.5-story stone house just off of where 9G is now, and North Broadway in Tivoli. Long gone. This picture was taken probably about 1900. But the Hoffmans were the major family landowners in the Tivoli community, and with interests in the freight forwarding business and shipping business down to the city. FDR was very proud to be a descendant of the original Hoffman in Tivoli, and I think so was Judge Egbert Benson, for whom our Historical Society is named. So the Hoffmans were people of importance. They could build a major house like this, and we're glad we have a photograph of it. Next. The Library of Congress map is of interest also because it's the only one of the maps that absolutely makes clear for whom it was made. It says it was made for Captain Martin Hoffman. He was the guy who lived in that house across from the Starr Library in 1798. And he wanted a version of the map, and it is a version. It's not exactly like the others. But it's of interest. It's also of interest because it reflects some facts that are not, that could not have been on the earlier maps, because it was made, we think this was made about 1800 or 1801. For instance, the Garretsons had moved in 1799 from Bolenbecker Road down to the riverfront south of Wilderstein, to Wilder Cliff. And They weren't there in 1798 and therefore are not shown on the 1798 map, but they are shown down there near the location of Wildenstein or later on this map. So we can date this about 1800. In fact, it says performed in March 1800 by Alexander Thompson. So we know that that's